What would you do if a creature that wasn't human saved your life? Would you tell the world, or stay silent to protect it from us? At nearly 80 years old, Margaret Holloway finally broke her silence. For over 5 decades, she kept a secret buried deep, a secret from the snowy wilderness of Absaroka, where, at age 27, she fell down a mountain ravine and should have died. But she didn't. When Margaret woke up, she wasn't alone. She was lying on animal hides, her broken ribs wrapped, her wounds cleaned with primitive but effective care. 2 massive, silent, fur-covered beings, one male, one female, watched over her. They didn't speak. They didn't trap her. They simply stayed. They fed her, protected her, and when she could finally walk, the male led her back, all the way to the edge of where humans begin. No words, no goodbye, just a quiet return and disappearance into the forest. Doctors later examined her injuries in disbelief. Her ribs were set correctly. No sign of infection. When asked who saved her, Margaret lied. Not out of fear, but because she knew. If she told the truth, humans would return to that forest, with guns and curiosity that kills. Now, with time running out, she wrote her story. Not to prove Bigfoot exists, but to prove that compassion can come from beyond humanity. Her final words. They weren't human, but they didn't leave me. So let me ask you, if a creature like that saved you, would you speak up? Or protect them in silence? And more importantly, where are you watching from tonight? What's your name, dear listener? Because stories like this, they deserve to be shared across oceans, across forests, across time itself. From my little corner of the world to yours, I'm sending you warmth, wonder, and the biggest hello to our curious community. If you believe in compassion beyond species, tap like, hit subscribe, and let's build a space for those who still believe in Bigfoot and in kindness. There were 2 things Maggie Abernathy no longer feared: winter and being forgotten. She sat by the window of her small kitchen, where the light spilled in just enough to soften the edges of her age. The wind pushed across the wheatgrass fields beyond the fence line, rattling the brittle stalks like old bones. Her hands, worn but steady, moved slowly over the yellowed paper. The pen scratched faintly, carving a line of thought that had waited decades to find breath. I don't need anyone to believe me. I just want to tell it before it's too late. She paused, set the pen down, and watched the steam curl off her chipped mug of tea. The silence of the house was complete. There was no clock ticking, no radio murmuring in the background. The only sound was the pulse of wind pressing against the window panes like a memory trying to return. Then a second line, smaller, slower, almost tender. There were 2 beings that saved me. They were not human. She didn't flinch as she wrote it. Didn't hesitate. That kind of truth had already burned through her once. It wasn't her job to make it palatable. It was her job to set it down. The envelope was addressed to someone she'd never met. Just a name she'd seen on a television segment someone else had left running in a waiting room. Mr. Den. The man who listened at midnight. That was all it took. She figured someone like him might understand why stories like hers belonged in the dark, where people could hear without laughing. People were more honest after midnight. The world felt a little closer to real when the house creaked and the wind threaded through the trees outside. So she picked him. That's why she was here, on a Thursday evening in the tail end of fall, with the wind beating against the house like it wanted in, and Maggie writing as though the walls could listen. I'm not trying to go on your show. I'm not trying to make a case. I'm just trying to set this down, because stories like this don't last unless someone says them out loud. And the thing that saved me, it deserves not to be forgotten. Her eyes drifted to the drawer. She didn't open it yet. Not yet. She breathed, slow and even. The light from the window dipped lower on the floor, bending like an old dog resting its chin on its paws. She remembered being 10, maybe 11, sitting in this same house with her mother in the next room. Silent, always silent. A woman with wide eyes and quiet hands who never seemed fully awake. Maggie had learned early how to cook eggs without burning them, how to clean out a cut with peroxide, how to recognize the difference between pain you could wait out and pain you needed help for. Her mother didn't leave her. She just didn't show up. Not really, not all the way. That was fine, Maggie managed. But what changed her? What cleaved something in her in half and sealed it shut? Came later. It was the summer she turned 17. A neighbor, old Mrs. Janey, had gone quiet for days. The smell brought someone around eventually. Maggie had been there when the sheriff pried the swollen door open and the flies bloomed into the hall like smoke. That kind of moment changes something permanent inside you. Not the death, but the knowing that someone could disappear and no one would come. After that, Maggie stopped assuming help would arrive. She learned to live like the last one left, not bitter, just realistic. And in time, that became comfort. Now she opened the drawer. It didn't stick. It never did. This drawer knew her touch. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, pressed flat beneath a small river stone. Maggie lifted the rock, unwrapped the fabric, and laid it across her knees like something sacred. The fibers were coarse, thick, once waterproofed. Old Army-issue jacket. She'd long since tossed the rest of it. But not this piece, because there, along the seam, was a thread of dried mineral-rich mud, the color of riverbanks in spring thaw. And nestled within that seam, still caught like it had grown there, a single braid of dried grass. Twisted, intentional. No human hand had sewn that, and no human hand had stayed beside her in that cold, when death was licking up her bones from the inside. She touched the braid like it might twitch. She hadn't shown it to anyone, not even Thomas, not even before he passed. She knew what people would say. She'd heard it all before. Shock, delirium, imagination filling the blanks. Let them. It didn't matter now. She wasn't looking for their agreement. She wasn't trying to defend what had happened, but she needed to say it, because someone had stayed. And Maggie Abernathy had lived long enough to know. That's the part that matters. She folded the cloth again, slowly, carefully, and placed it back in the drawer. Closed it like closing a promise. A long silence followed, as though the house itself was waiting. Then she picked up the pen again. This happened in 1957. I was 27. The mountains were quiet, and I'd gone alone. She stared out the window. The sun was beginning to drop. The light turned gold, then brass, then something blue and hollow. I died once in the snow, she wrote, the letters tightening as if to keep from shaking. And they pulled me back. She set the pen down. The wind was steady now, not frantic, just sure of itself. Like it had come all this way to listen. Maggie let the stillness return. She didn't ask for more time. She didn't ask for belief. She only asked to be remembered. Not for who she was, but for what had been given to her in silence. For the kindness that wasn't human, but more human than most. And the drawer held the proof. Not to the world, but to her. Because sometimes, a story only needs to be said once. And not for the world to believe it, but so the kindness at its center doesn't get buried with the one who lived it. The mountains did not announce her arrival. They never did. In the late fall of 1957, the Absaroka Range lay open and quiet, stretched beneath a sky so clear it felt sharpened. The air had that brittle edge that warned of snow without promising it. Leaves were gone from the aspens, stripped clean, leaving pale trunks standing like bones. Ice had begun to stitch itself along the north-facing stones, thin and nearly invisible, the kind that only betrayed itself after it was too late. Maggie Abernathy moved through it alone. She preferred it that way. Always had. Her pack sat square against her shoulders, balanced and familiar. Inside were things she trusted because they never pretended to be more than what they were. A bolt-action rifle, clean and oiled. A length of jerky wrapped in wax paper. A metal match case that clicked softly when she shifted her weight. A compass with a scratched glass face. A military-issue sleeping bag, faded green, still warm when zipped tight. No radio, no camera. No map marked with promises she didn't intend to keep. No one knew her route. That was not carelessness, that was choice. She had learned long ago that disappearing, even briefly, felt like breathing. The world had a way of pressing too close. Out here, the mountains didn't ask her to explain herself. They didn't wonder where she was going or why she hadn't married or why she kept to herself. They just stood there, massive and indifferent, letting her pass through as small and temporary as everything else. The first day was quiet in a way that felt earned. She made camp near a dry creek bed, the stones worn smooth by years of water that had long since moved on. She worked efficiently, without wasted motion, hands sure and calm. The fire was small, shielded, fed just enough to keep from smoking. She ate slowly, watching the light slip down the slopes until the mountains turned the color of old iron. She noticed signs without lingering on them. Tracks of a young elk in the soft earth, droppings scattered near the tree line, scratches on bark where antlers had rubbed. Nothing unusual, nothing that demanded a story. That night, the cold settled in quietly, like it had found its place and meant to stay. Maggie zipped herself into the sleeping bag, rifle within arm's reach, boots tucked close for warmth. She slept lightly, as she always did, waking once when the wind shifted, then again when the stars seemed brighter than before. Morning came clean and pale. The sun rose without warmth, throwing light across the rocks in a way that made every surface look deceptively solid. Maggie ate, packed, and moved on, following the elk's trail upward. It led her toward higher ground, toward a slope that cut across a band of exposed stone dusted with frost. She paused at the base of it. The mountain rose steeply, the rock face broken into shelves and narrow ledges. The ice was thin, almost polite in its restraint. The kind that didn't look like danger until it was already under your boot. She felt the familiar lift of confidence. I can take this. It wasn't arrogance. It was memory. She had climbed worse. She had trusted her body through years of work and weather and solitude. She shifted the rifle across her back, tested the first few steps, and began to climb. The world narrowed to her breath and the placement of her feet. Stone, ice. The moment itself was small. Her right foot slid just enough to steal the certainty from her weight. Not a dramatic slip. Not a warning. Just a quiet betrayal. The kind the mountains specialize in. Her balance went, then everything else followed. The rifle caught on a jut of rock and wrenched sideways. Her body twisted. She felt herself spin, saw the sky flash past. Then the stone rushed up to meet her. The sound came before the pain, a sharp crack, close and intimate, like something breaking inside her. Her ribs struck first, then her shoulder, then the side of her head. She rolled, momentum carrying her down the slope in a sickening, helpless tumble. 30 feet, maybe more. Rock scraped skin, breath tore out of her chest in a white burst. Then she slid into a shallow drift, snow swallowing her like an open mouth. She lay still, stunned, the world ringing. Blood spread beneath her, dark against the white. Each breath came jagged, shallow, as if her chest had forgotten how to open fully. Her left arm refused to answer when she tried to move it. Pain flared there, bright and precise. She forced herself to stay conscious. Her eyes found the rifle. It had come to rest several feet away, wedged at an angle between two rocks. The barrel pointed nowhere important, but the trigger was caught, snagged on stone. One wrong shift, one slide of weight, one vibration. It could fire. The thought cut through her haze like cold water. She dragged herself sideways with her good arm, teeth clenched, the movement sending a blade of pain through her ribs. Snow packed against her clothes. Her breath fogged in front of her face. She moved just enough to be out of its line, then stopped, shaking, heart pounding in her ears. She laughed once, a thin, broken sound. To survive all this and die by her own gun, the mountain didn't respond. The cold began its work. It crept in slow and methodical, numbing first, then deepening, sinking past skin and muscle into something more personal. Maggie tried to assess herself the way she always did. Count fingers, move toes, breathe. Her fingers tingled. Her toes felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Her shoulder throbbed with a heavy, wrong sensation. Her ribs protested every inhale. She knew enough to know it was bad. She closed her eyes for a moment, then forced them open again. That was when she heard it. Not sound, exactly. Not the snap of a branch or the crunch of boots in snow. It was softer than that. A suggestion of movement. A presence that made the air feel different. Something was around her. She didn't see anything. Couldn't turn her head enough to look. But the sense of being considered settled over her like a weight. Not hunted, not stalked. Observed. The snow near her shifted slightly, though there was no wind there. The feeling sharpened, then eased, like a breath taken and released. Maggie's heart hammered, then slowed, caught between fear and exhaustion. She waited for teeth, for claws, for the end. Nothing came. Minutes passed. Or seconds. Time had begun to lose its edges. Her vision blurred, then steadied. The pain dulled, replaced by a spreading cold that felt almost gentle in comparison. Her thoughts drifted, unanchored, touching fragments of memory without settling anywhere for long. Her mother's quiet face. The smell of old paper in the school library. The sound of wind through tall grass. She understood distantly what was happening. This was how it went. She had seen it before, in others. The moment when the body stops fighting, when the cold feels like relief. She exhaled, long and slow, and let her eyes close. All right then. That was when the cold stopped. Not eased, not shifted. Stopped. The sensation was abrupt enough to register, even through her fading awareness. The bite of the snow against her back vanished. The pressure beneath her changed. She felt herself lifted, the movement careful and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever held her was aware of exactly where she hurt. Her body was no longer touching the ground. She didn't see arms, didn't feel hands. There was only the certainty of motion, smooth and controlled, carrying her away from the place where she had fallen. Her head lolled against something warm. The last thing she noticed before darkness took her was the absence of pain where the snow had been, and the certainty, deep and unarguable, that something had decided she was not finished yet. The mountain remained silent. No shout followed her fall. No gunshot echoed. No one came running. There would be no tracks found later. No voice calling her name. No sign that anyone had ever been there at all. Only the place where she had been, empty now, and the faint smear of blood in the snow, already beginning to freeze. Somewhere above, unseen, the sky stayed clear and sharp, and Maggie Abernathy was carried into the dark by something that moved without sound, choosing to act when no one else could hear. She woke to firelight, not sunlight, not the faint gray of dawn through canvas or the flat, unkind glow of a flashlight left running. This was gold and low, flickering in a way that moved across the ceiling like water. It filled her nose before her eyes could understand it, smoke but clean, earthy, mixed with something ancient. Moss, maybe, or stone after rain. Something that made her feel like she was still underground, and warm. That was the other thing. Maggie Abernathy was warm. Her body, which had last belonged to a broken animal half buried in snow, was now wrapped in layers that didn't belong to her. Beneath her, something soft pressed against her spine. Furs, maybe, but old, dense, layered. Not synthetic, not man-made. Real. The kind that still smelled faintly wild. Another layer of what felt like coarser hair had been drawn over her chest. She tried to move her left arm. It didn't scream, but it didn't obey either. She turned her head slightly. The air shifted. Something about the silence wasn't right. It wasn't that it was too quiet. It was that it wasn't empty. There was a rhythm to it, like a room that had someone else in it, holding their breath. Her fingers touched the edge of the fur. Her knuckles brushed something rough. She blinked until the ceiling stopped swimming. Rock. The ceiling was rock. Natural, not carved. A shallow dome with soot-darkened patches above a small fire set low in a hollow. Not much smoke. She blinked again. There was a vent. Not a man-made chimney, but a natural fissure just wide enough to draw the smoke upward and out. Whoever, or whatever, had built the fire had done so in a spot that used the shape of the cave itself to draw. Efficient. Intentional. Not a campfire built by accident. Her shoulder was bandaged. She hadn't done it. There was no gauze, no tape. Instead, strips of what felt like plant fiber, woven together tight enough to hold, looped gently but firmly over her collarbone and under her armpit. Her ribs were compressed by something firm, but not hard. No buckles, no elastic, just pressure. Support. Her left hand twitched. Pain flared, then settled. Someone had cleaned the blood. There was a layer of dried something, brittle now, like it had once been clay, caked across the bruises along her side. She touched it with her good hand. It flaked slightly, pale gray, mixed with the smell in the air. Mud, rich with minerals, dried smooth, not slapped on, spread with precision. A seal. Maggie didn't speak. She listened. The fire crackled, but not loud. The warmth against her skin came from more than just the flames. The cave itself held the heat like an animal, radiating it gently. Then she heard it. A sound at the edge of everything. A footfall, but not the kind that snapped twigs or shuffled boots. It came like pressure. Weight spread wide, careful not to echo. She didn't move, kept her breathing shallow. It wasn't just one. A shape passed across the fire's glow. Tall, thick through the shoulders. Arms longer than any person's should be. Hands swinging low, moving with a kind of fluid quiet that didn't belong to something clumsy or confused. The firelight caught the outline. Brown hair, coarse and long, moving slightly with each step. The chest was broad, the head tilted slightly toward her, but not in fear, in assessment. Another figure followed, smaller, more narrow at the hips, but not weak. Her movements, Maggie could feel that much, were deliberate. She carried something, a bowl, wooden, carved in a way that made no sense and all the sense in the world. No angles, no lines, just form and function, shaped from something thick and old. The larger one didn't approach. Instead, it moved to the edge of the cave, stood in front of the entrance, a silent wall, watching not her, but outward. Like a guardian posted, not a jailer, the smaller one walked forward slowly. No sound. Maggie tensed. The creature stopped a few feet from her, lowered the bowl, not tossed, not dropped. Set it down, soft, careful, like setting medicine beside a sick child who might not wake. The creature's face was almost human in its stillness. Wide eyes, deep set beneath a heavy brow. No aggression, no twitch. Just watching, waiting. Maggie didn't move. The creature turned, walked back toward the fire, and sat. Not hunched, not slack. It moved like something that had rules, like something that chose when to use its strength. Maggie's eyes drifted to the edge of the cave. Her rifle. She hadn't noticed it before. It sat in the corner, leaned carefully against a smooth wall. The barrel pointed down. The bolt intact. Unloaded. She hadn't done that either. It was out of reach, but not destroyed. Not taken. She swallowed. The smaller one turned back toward her and nudged the bowl forward slightly with one long hand. Then it pulled its fingers back and looked at her. Nothing forced. No sound. Just a suggestion. Maggie didn't drink. Not yet. But she didn't close her eyes again either. Her breath had slowed. They didn't speak. Not to her, not to each other. But the silence wasn't empty. It had weight, like something earned. Like a rule being followed in a room where everyone understood it without needing to say it. They watched her for a while. Then, without fanfare, The larger one turned and stepped outside. The smaller one sat near the fire and began doing something Maggie couldn't quite see. Sorting, twisting, weaving strands of something pale between thick fingers. It looked like nothing she could name, and everything she remembered from dreams she hadn't meant to keep. Maggie closed her eyes again, not from pain, not from fear, just to rest. But this time she knew she wouldn't die, because whatever they were, they'd had the chance to end her. And instead, they gave her a place to warm her bones. That was the part she wouldn't forget. She'd been alone so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be noticed without being judged, to be watched without being measured, to be helped without being claimed. When she opened her eyes again, the cave was darker, the fire lower. The smaller figure had placed a second fur over her without touching her skin. The rifle was still in the corner. The cold stayed outside. And Maggie Abernathy, for the first time in decades, felt something she hadn't named since childhood. Safe, and even then she didn't speak, because there was nothing to say. When the wild finds you broken and doesn't finish you off, sometimes the only thing you can do is lay still and listen to the way it breathes. And in that quiet, wrapped in warmth she didn't ask for, from creatures she couldn't name, Maggie began to heal, not just the body, but the part that had forgotten the world could be gentle, not human, but gentle. And sometimes, that's the part that saves you. The pain never left. Not entirely. It hummed like an old engine deep beneath her skin, rising in waves when she moved, spiking sharp when she breathed too deep. But still, it was quieter now. Tamed, not erased, not gone, but softened by the steady rhythm of something that felt, impossibly, like care. Maggie woke to the sound of something heavy shifting its weight just beyond the fire. A sound not made by boots or paws, but something slower, broader. She didn't flinch. Her body knew better than that now. After days, 3, maybe 4, she couldn't be sure. The edges of fear had worn away like stone shaped by water. What remained wasn't trust, exactly. But it was no longer panic either. She blinked slowly, then winced. Her ribs still protested, though not like before. Her shoulder was less swollen. Her throat was dry. Her stomach, aware. Hunger was a strange mercy. The smaller one was already kneeling beside her. The light of the fire cast a copper sheen across its fur. It didn't speak. It didn't reach for her. It simply placed one large hand near her wrist and held it there, not touching, just near enough to feel the heat. A pause. Then the hand moved slightly, hovering along her forearm. It was checking something. Maggie watched, breath slow. She could feel the way its eyes moved, scanning, not searching but observing, as if measuring pulse without touch, as if reading pain by scent or shadow or something older. The creature stood and disappeared into the deeper end of the cave. When it returned, it carried flat stones, warm to the touch. It set them in a loose semicircle around her body, each placed with slow, deliberate care. Not too close, not too far. Heat radiated from them in pulses. Another hand, this time with a small wooden vessel, lowered something dark and steaming toward her lips. She sniffed. It wasn't pine, not sap. Something bitter, maybe roots soaked in warm water. She didn't drink it first, just smelled. Waited. The creature didn't move. It knelt, still and solid, eyes lowered as if waiting for her to decide on her own. She drank. It was bitter, yes, but not sharp. A dull, grounding bitterness that sat heavy on the tongue. After a few sips, it left behind a faint taste of something sweet, like the last echo of winter berries. Her body felt it first. Not a rush, not a jolt, but a slow settling. The ache in her ribs dulled. Her hand stopped twitching. She whispered once, not to them, but to herself. "Thank you." The creature didn't react, but it left the bowl there and stood. Maggie didn't remember falling asleep, only waking again to the scent of meat, soft, mild, mixed with the smell of something boiled low and slow. Another bowl. Thicker this time. Something close to broth, but richer. Fat skimmed the surface in thin swirls. Bits of something, root perhaps, floated inside. She ate with her fingers. They didn't offer utensils. It didn't matter. Her hands shook at first, but the warmth steadied her. The meat was tender, already pulled into strands. No seasoning, but the flavor was clean. Earthy. There was no doubt it had come from something hunted. Not bought, not raised. Something taken from the wild and shared. The larger one returned from outside. Snow clung to its fur in patches. It carried nothing. No blood, no fresh kill. Only silence. It sat near the fire, not facing her, but near enough to be a presence. Maggie noticed the way it shifted its weight just slightly every few minutes. It wasn't restless. It was alert. A watcher. It didn't sleep. Not deeply. Not like humans. She watched for hours one night, maybe two, before she realized the pattern. One of them always remained upright, breathing steady, shoulders square, like a sentry, but not just against danger. They were watching time. When one rested, the other rose. No words passed between them. No nods, no signal. Just a rhythm. Understood and obeyed. At first, she thought it was instinct. Then she noticed the scratches along the far wall of the cave, faint but deliberate, carved just above eye level for someone much taller than her. Dozens of them. Some newer, still sharp. Others weathered, faded into the rock. Not random. Not the claw marks of something wild and thoughtless. These were tallied, aligned, measured, like a calendar. Maggie stared at them for a long time. The smaller one noticed, walked over, paused beside her. She didn't speak. Neither did it. But something in the way it shifted its body, a subtle angle, a deliberate placement, told her that it had placed those marks there. Not for her, not for visitors, but for memory. They kept time, not in days or hours, but in seasons, in passages, in presence. Later, when the pain returned, sharper that night, her shoulder aching from the cold, the creature returned with another clay-like substance. This one smelled of wet stone and something mineral. It spread it along her arm in slow, wide strokes, never touching skin directly, always using a flat piece of bark like a brush. The substance dried cool, then warm, then tight, like a second skin. The swelling lessened by morning. She didn't dream. Or if she did, they were too quiet to remember. The days passed that way, each blending into the next, marked only by the subtle changes in light outside the cave and the rituals inside. They fed her. They watched over her. But they never touched her skin. Even when she stumbled, trying to rise, they didn't rush. The smaller one would stand close, just enough to catch her if she fell, but would not carry her. They allowed her to struggle. She understood it, somewhere deep, that this was part of the agreement, that healing didn't mean being saved. It meant being allowed to return to herself. The first time she sat upright for more than a minute, the smaller one brought her a bundle of fur and laid it beside her. Inside, carefully wrapped, were the clothes she'd worn the day she fell. Cleaned, dried, repaired. The tear in her jacket had been stitched with something pale and fibrous. Grass or sinew, she couldn't tell. Over the seam, a layer of the same mineral mud had been spread thin, then buffed smooth. It wasn't perfect, but it was careful. She ran her fingers over the seam. Her throat caught. Later that night, she lay half awake, listening to the fire crackle, the wind outside muffled by the walls of the cave. The larger one sat near the mouth, unmoving, blocking the view but not the cold. The smaller one slept, or appeared to. On the far side, its body curled slightly, back to the wall. Maggie whispered again, barely a sound. "I've never been taken care of like this." No one answered. But in the quiet, in the way the fire was fed just enough, in the way the walls held in the heat, she felt something shift. Not outside, inside. Something in her had started to trust. Not blindly, not foolishly, but with a kind of bone-deep recognition that comes only when someone stays through the pain. Not because they have to, but because they choose to. Maggie turned on her side, careful of her ribs, and stared at the markings on the wall until sleep claimed her. And for the first time in her memory, she did not wake alone. She woke to the sound of something breathing near her, not loud, not close, just steady. Like a song older than language. It didn't say she mattered. It didn't try to fix her. It just stayed. And somehow, that was enough to begin healing what even the earth couldn't reach. The snow outside didn't speak, but it had a way of listening. By the 6th or 7th day, Maggie had stopped counting. Her body had mostly quieted. The bruises had faded to yellow. The ache in her ribs pulsed only when she twisted. The shoulder would take longer. But she could sit up now without gasping. She could sip broth without needing help. And when the smaller one, she'd started thinking of her that way, the female, entered the cave, Maggie no longer tensed. She stayed very still as the creature approached. Not because she was afraid, but because something in her had learned to match their rhythm, to not rush, to wait. The female knelt just far enough that their hands didn't touch, then placed a bowl of water near her and gently pushed it forward with the side of her palm. Maggie's hand moved slowly. Not trembling this time, just careful. She reached for the bowl. The creature didn't move. Her fingers wrapped around the wood, cool, solid. She drank. The female shifted her weight back, still crouched, then stood. Her head tilted slightly. Not curious, not expectant. More like acknowledgement. A quiet kind of nod Maggie felt rather than saw. The distance between them was deliberate. Every motion had a boundary. Not fear-based, not hesitant, but chosen. That was the first time Maggie felt it. The line. Not just a physical distance, a rule. No touch unless necessary. No gesture without meaning. They moved with purpose. No wasted noise, no theatrical kindness. Their care had never been passive. But it also never crossed her, even when she'd cried once in the dark. Not loud, just a soft tremor of breath into the fur-lined bedding. They hadn't moved toward her. They had stayed exactly where they were, letting her keep the sorrow to herself. She understood that now. And in some part of her, she was grateful. She tested the air between them the next morning. Not with words, just an action. Her hand, open. She didn't raise it much. Just a few inches off her lap, palm tilted slightly toward the female as she approached. It wasn't a plea, just a question. The creature paused mid-step. Then slowly she bent down, not to touch, but to set the bowl a few inches closer than before. Then she stepped back. That was the answer. Maggie lowered her hand. This was the agreement. Later that night, a noise outside the cave shifted everything. A sound she hadn't heard since her fall. Something real. Animal. Not myth. The low rasping huff of breath, too heavy for a coyote. A soft click of claws against stone. Then stillness. Maggie froze. The firelight danced against the far wall. The larger one stood now, near the entrance. His body blocked most of the view beyond the cave, but she could feel it. The thing outside was close. He didn't growl, didn't snarl. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, knees loose, spine straight. And then, he stomped once. Not hard, not angry. A rhythm. 2 more times, not loud, but deliberate. Then silence. No chase, no roar, just that. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was cleared. The presence outside faded. Maggie didn't hear it leave, but it was gone. She looked at the male, still standing like a tree just inside the threshold, and something in her stomach turned cold and warm at the same time. It wasn't just strength. It was command. That rhythm, the stomp, it wasn't warning. It was law. And something in the wild had listened. That night, while the fire burned low, she sat upright a little longer. Her shoulder ached, but she didn't care. Her thoughts turned to that sound, to the way the male had signaled, not reacted. He hadn't defended her out of panic. He had decided, and whatever hurt it had left. Maggie looked down at her hands. Her fingers still bore the dirt of healing. Her nails were chipped, her knuckles swollen from days of immobility. But they were hers, still working, still moving. She closed them into fists, then let them go. She'd been trying to remember details from the day she fell. Not just the pain or the sound of bone hitting rock, but earlier, before. There had been something on the trail. Scratches on tree trunks. Not animal. Too high. Something about the spacing, the vertical rhythm. She'd ignored them then, chalking it up to time or weather or elk rut. But now she remembered. There'd been footprints. Only she hadn't seen them as such. Just patches where the snow had melted in odd shapes near the edge of the stream where she'd camped. Too large. No boot tread. She'd told herself they were bear tracks distorted by thaw. But they weren't. She knew that now. They'd been watching. Not from fear. From decision. They could have stayed hidden, let her die. But they didn't. They had chosen. And now she understood something that shifted her breath. They hadn't just found her after the fall. They'd already known she was there, had likely been following her for days, evaluating. And for reasons she didn't know, but could feel. They had judged her worthy to save. She tried standing the next morning. The smaller one watched. Maggie gritted her teeth, hand on the stone wall, pulling herself upright, inch by inch. Her legs trembled. Her balance wavered. The world spun once. She nearly fell. The female stepped forward, but didn't touch. Just stood, ready, waiting. Maggie regained her footing. The creature nodded, just slightly, then turned away, not in dismissal, but as if to say, "You did it." That moment stayed with her longer than the fire's warmth. Later, Maggie sat near the cave's entrance, staring out into the snow. The male was near, silent, watching the tree line. The wind moved through the forest like it had a secret. But she wasn't cold. The coat around her had been patched again, this time with dried grass seamed into a tight braid near the cuff. Decorative almost, but deliberate. She ran her fingers over it. They weren't just mending what was broken. They were returning her whole. And she knew then, without a word, without confirmation, that they wouldn't keep her forever. That someday soon they would lead her back to the line between this world and hers. They had done their part. They would let her go. But not yet. Not until she could walk without falling. Not until her breath came easy. Not until she could carry the story. Not for others, but for herself. And maybe, just maybe, to protect the ones who never asked to be found. She leaned back, eyes closed, as the fire popped behind her. The snow fell outside in soft waves, and for the first time in her life, Maggie Abernathy realized what it meant to be looked after not out of duty, but out of choice. And what it meant, deeper still, to be seen by something that had nothing to prove, something that would never take credit for her healing, only make space for it, and then, when the time came, step aside. The morning came without a sound. No bird song, no wind. Just that pale, gray light that settles before snow and never asks permission. It was the kind of quiet that made even breath feel loud. Maggie woke to the scent of the fire having died sometime in the night, and the faintest warmth of coals tucked in their stone bed like something left behind on purpose. She opened her eyes and knew, before she moved, that something had changed. There was no pain screaming for her attention now, just a dull stiffness, like her bones were still deciding whether to forgive her. She sat up slowly. No one hovered. No bowl was offered. No steam rose from the corner. The female was gone. The male wasn't in the entrance. She was alone, but not abandoned. That was the difference. Her coat lay folded at the edge of the bedding. Not tossed, folded, like someone had taken time, care, precision. She reached for it and paused. The seam along the shoulder, the one that had torn when she'd fallen, was no longer frayed. It had been mended. Not with thread, but something else. A braid of thin grass, dried and set with a glaze of that same mineral paste. Smooth now, sturdy. Someone had sewn her coat back together with the same hands that had patched her. Inside the coat's lining, tucked where her fingers wouldn't immediately find it, was something small and warm to the touch. She turned the pocket out. A smooth black pebble. Not special, not shiny. Just known. Familiar in a way that didn't make sense. She hadn't seen it before, but it felt like it had been with her the whole time. Her boots were clean, no mud, no ice. The laces had been re-threaded, her socks dry. Her rifle leaned in the same corner it had always occupied. Still unloaded, still untouched, still respected. It was all there, laid out like a quiet ceremony. Not rushed, not hesitant, just ready. And when she stepped into her boots and stood, slow but steady, he was there. The male stood near the cave's mouth, one hand on the edge of the stone wall, not looking at her, not waiting, simply being. As though he'd always been part of the cave and had just decided to become visible again. She didn't speak. He didn't move. Then he turned his head just enough for her to know. That was it. It was time. There was no push, no gesture. Just presence. The kind that invited, not commanded. The kind that left the choice with her, though they both knew the decision had already been made. She followed. Outside, the air was sharp. New snow had fallen overnight, maybe 2 inches, still soft. The trees wore it like lace. No footprints marked the ground. Not hers, not his. He moved ahead, and yet there was no trail. His steps pressed down, but somehow didn't stay. The wind didn't pick up. The forest held its breath. They walked for a while, not fast, not far. She didn't ask where. Her feet found the rhythm without thinking. Her shoulder still ached, but her lungs filled deeper now. The cold pinched but didn't cut. Her boots didn't slip. Her coat held in the warmth like a memory wrapped around her. He walked just far enough ahead that she could follow without hurrying. And when the trail narrowed, he slowed. When it sloped, he turned back slightly, not offering a hand, just checking. Then continued, like leading a fawn to water, not a woman back to the world. And she realized something as they moved. He wasn't taking her out the same way she'd come. He was guiding her through paths she hadn't seen, through low ravines where the wind didn't reach, across frozen creeks that held just enough ice to bear her weight. He knew where to step, where not to. He avoided exposed ledges, avoided dense underbrush, avoided anything that would tax her more than necessary. Not the fastest route, the safest. The one someone would take if they understood what it meant to fall and not get up again. They reached a rise just before midday. The sun was weak behind the clouds, more suggestion than light, but enough to show the stretch of land below. Bare trees, low shrubs, a frozen wash, and a trail. A real one. Not an animal path, but something made by humans. Wide enough for boots and wheels, a cut in the land, familiar in its unnaturalness. Maggie stopped. He didn't. He walked to the tree line and stood there, one foot still in snow, the other almost on bare earth. Not stepping over, just standing near it. His body turned slightly, not away from her, not toward the woods, but toward the edge. The boundary. She knew. She understood what it meant. He wouldn't go further. Couldn't. This wasn't his place. And this wasn't hers anymore. Not really. But it was where she had to go. She stepped up beside him. Not too close. Just enough to see what he saw. To see the line she had to cross. The wind moved then. Not a gust. Not dramatic. Just enough to stir the trees. Just enough to lift a few flakes of snow from the branches above and let them fall between them like breath. She turned, met his eyes, and there was no question in them, no plea, just presence. She nodded once, not to say goodbye, to say I see you. She took one more step, and when she turned back again, he was gone. Not gone like something fleeing, Gone like something that had never been there. No trail, no sound, not even the shift of snow. Just the forest, standing as it always had. Silent, still, watching. And her, standing at the line, the one between what the world believed and what she now knew. She stepped onto the trail. It felt strange beneath her boots. Too wide, too hard. But it held her. Her legs didn't buckle. Her breath didn't catch. Her shoulders still ached, yes, but it carried her weight. And so she walked, slow, alone, but no longer lonely. Each step a promise not to forget. Each footfall a vow not to explain, but to remember. And somewhere far behind her, though she'd never see it again, the cave stayed warm, the fire still breathing, the stone walls still holding the scratches of seasons, and the two figures who had taught her what it meant to be saved without being claimed. And somewhere ahead, down that trail, beyond the reach of snow and memory, a cabin waited, and questions she wouldn't answer, and faces that had already written her off. But she wasn't afraid of them, not anymore, because she knew the truth, and because they had shown her the kind of love that doesn't ask to be believed, only lived through. And then, let go. When Maggie reached the edge of the ranger station clearing, she stopped walking. She hadn't meant to, not consciously, but her boots froze in place. Not from fear, not from pain, from something deeper. That peculiar kind of weight that comes from stepping out of one world and back into another, knowing full well that the place you came from was never meant to be found. The air was thinner down here. Or maybe it just felt that way because her chest had changed. Grown used to something slower, quieter, something that didn't ask questions the moment you opened your mouth. Her ribs still ached and her shoulder throbbed every third breath. But she could stand. She could speak. She just didn't know if she wanted to. A puff of chimney smoke curled from the station's roof. Warm yellow light spilled onto the snow through one crooked window pane. There was a truck out front, hood still steaming, windshield half scraped. Maggie took a breath and stepped out from the tree line. The first man who saw her was a young ranger, maybe mid-20s. Pale, clean uniform. Mouth slightly open like a screen door blown wide by a gust of disbelief. She could see him freeze for just a second, long enough for her to know he was calculating something. His face went from shock to concern to disbelief, all before he said a word. "Ma'am," he called, stepping out. "You, Jesus, are you Maggie Abernathy?" She nodded. That was all she gave him. He called someone inside. Another man came out, then a woman. They moved like people approaching the scene of a crime. Tentative, wide-eyed, unsure if they were supposed to be relieved or terrified. "Ma'am," the second ranger said, squinting at her like she might disappear again if he looked too hard. "We had you on the list." She raised an eyebrow. "What list?" He fumbled with the radio on his hip. "We had you marked as deceased." The words came out soft, almost apologetic. She didn't flinch. Just pulled her coat tighter around her and walked past him, toward the steps. Each movement deliberate, heavy. She didn't look back. Inside the station, the air was too warm, the light too bright. Someone brought her tea. Too sweet. Another ranger handed her a blanket. She was already wearing 2 coats. A fourth asked where she'd been. She stared at them, one at a time, and said nothing. Not yet. The questions came quicker after that, sharper, louder. "Where did you fall? How long were you out? Did someone find you? Who brought you back? Were you alone the whole time?" Maggie answered the way an old mountain answers the wind, with silence when it wanted, and just enough sound when it chose. "I was lost," she said. "For how long?" "I don't know." "Where?" "In the range." Someone else piped up from the corner. "No tracks out there. Snow's been fresh. We didn't see any signs." She didn't argue, didn't explain. The woman ranger stepped closer. "Ma'am, with respect, what you're saying doesn't line up with the report. You were off-grid for 10 days. We called off the search on day 5. There was no signal, no signs of movement, not even heat signatures on flyover. It doesn't make sense." Maggie took another sip of tea. She said it quietly. "I didn't ask you to find me. That shut the room down for a moment. Then someone, probably the one in charge, stepped forward and spoke softer. "Look, I know this is a shock, but we're gonna need a little more to put in the file. Just something, a name, a trail, anything." Maggie looked him square in the face. "Someone helped me," she said. He leaned in slightly. "Who?" She didn't answer. "Not directly. Someone who doesn't want to be found." His brows drew in. "You were with a survivalist?" She didn't nod, didn't confirm, but let them think what they needed to, because anything else, anything closer to truth, would only give them a reason to chase. They brought in a doctor, or maybe a nurse. It was hard to tell. Older man, glasses, salt and pepper beard. He checked her vitals, asked about her shoulder, examined the bruises. He touched the bandage over her ribs and paused. "Where'd you get this wrapped?" he asked. She didn't reply. He leaned closer. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. "It's not standard, but it's good, clean. You sure you didn't go to a clinic?" She let him wonder. He pulled her sleeve up to check circulation and found a smear of dry mud just above her wrist, hard and thin, like clay that had set into the grain of her skin. "What's this?" She looked at it, shrugged. "Earth," she said. He didn't smile, just nodded. Later that evening, when they offered her a cot in the back room and a fresh change of clothes, she accepted the clothes and declined the rest. She wasn't ready to sleep in walls again. Not yet. Maybe never the same way. As she changed behind the partition, she felt something shift in her coat's inside pocket. Her hand moved instinctively. It was still there. The braid of grass, the dried mud, the promise. She ran her fingers along the texture, slow, careful, like touching the edge of a secret. She held it in her palm and closed her fist around it. No one saw. And if they had, they wouldn't have known what it meant. In the days that followed, rumors started. One of the rangers let something slip to the press. Some woman found after being lost for nearly 2 weeks. No injury records, no photo, just her name and the phrase, "refused to comment." A few papers ran the story under strange titles. "Ghost of Absaroka," "The Woman Who Walked Out." One journalist called to request an interview. She didn't answer. Another wrote a piece speculating it was all a hoax. She didn't correct them. She moved back into her house at the edge of Cody. The old neighbors stared from behind their curtains. Someone left flowers on her porch. Another taped a Bible verse to her mailbox. She stayed quiet. She bought groceries, nodded to the clerk, took her mail from the box without speaking. And every now and then, at night, she'd go out onto the porch and sit with the old wool blanket across her knees and stare at the trees beyond the fence line. Not because she expected anything, because silence had become a kind of companion, and memory a kind of shelter. But there was one thing that kept her grounded. The truth she never told, that she had lied, not to protect herself, but to protect them. She knew what would happen if she spoke. Men with long-range scopes and padded vests would flood those woods. Helicopters, cameras, bait traps, research grants, exploiters, believers, skeptics. And not a single one would ask why a creature would bother to save a woman who'd already given up. No one would ask what it meant to be chosen for mercy. They'd only ask how to catch it, how to prove it, how to drag it into daylight. So she said nothing. Let the world believe she was delusional, or lucky, or haunted. And in the back of her drawer, beneath folded scarves and an old compass that no longer pointed north, she kept the braid, still whole, still smelling faintly of earth and something older, something that had stood beside her when no one else would. And when the nights grew long and the wind returned through the chimney flue, she would reach for it, not to remember what happened, but to remind herself what not to reveal. Some truths don't need an audience, only a keeper. And sometimes, silence is the greatest gift you can give the ones who saved your life. The tape was gone. It had been nearly a year since Maggie mailed the package. A padded envelope, plain, anonymous. Inside, a cassette marked only with the date January 2nd, 1999, and a letter written in the same firm hand that had once traced stories into the soft edge of a kitchen window fogged by snow. She had sent it not to a newsroom or university, but to a man who listened to the kind of stories that made most people roll their eyes or lower their voice. A man who recorded things late at night, when the world was softer, more open to believing. She had asked for nothing in return. No call, no reply. She just wanted the tape to exist somewhere outside her house, in case she didn't wake up one day. In case the words died in her throat before she found the courage to speak them aloud. She had placed it in the mailbox just after dawn and didn't look back. 3 months later, she learned he had died. A heart attack in his home. Alone. The tape never aired. No record surfaced. His sister said she never found any envelopes in the studio drawers. Maggie didn't ask again. For weeks, she sat with that silence. Not angry, not regretful. Just paused. The story she had risked telling, the one she'd carried for decades, the one with breath and muscle and a heartbeat all its own, was gone. Not erased. Just unspoken. She thought that would be the end of it. Until last week, when her chest began to ache in a way that didn't feel like old wounds. Not muscle, not bone, something deeper. And she realized, with a calm so strange it almost felt like snow, if she didn't speak now, no one ever would. So she reached out, this time, to a younger man, a researcher, barely in his 40s, someone who didn't chase stories for profit, who studied patterns and people, who still believed that some truths were worth listening to, even when they didn't come with proof. He came quietly, no cameras, no promises. Just a voice recorder and a legal pad he barely touched. He listened. They sat in the back room of her house, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and orange oil. A small lamp burned low. The curtains were drawn. The hour was late enough that the neighbors wouldn't look in. And she told him, not everything, but enough. She told him about the fall, the cave, the fire. The ones who had stood beside her when her body failed and her spirit began to loosen from the bones. She told him about the way they placed the water bowl with care, about the sound of their breathing at night, about the feeling of being watched not with judgment, but with intent. She described the braid sewn into her coat, the rhythm of footsteps that never left tracks, the silence so deep it taught her how to speak again. But not once did she give a location. He asked. She smiled, not cruelly, not coldly, just enough to say you already know the answer. She told him why she hadn't spoken until now, because if she had told it in 1957, they would have hunted them. If she had told it in 1965, they would have tried to cage them. If she had told it in 1972, they would have made a museum exhibit. And in all those years, no one would have asked the right question. Not what are they, but why did they help you? She let the silence sit after that. He didn't push. He just turned off the recorder, and when he left, she didn't ask if he would share it. She only asked him to wait until she was gone. 2 nights later, she sat at the window again. Same kitchen, same chair. Older hands now, slower heart. But something steady still lived in her spine. She reached into the drawer, pulled out the old patch of cloth folded so many times it felt like paper. The braid was still there, pressed into the seam like a promise dried by time. She held it in her lap. No tears, no speech, just presence. I'm not telling this because I want attention, she said, almost to herself. I'm telling it because I owe them more than silence. She looked out at the trees. Winter was loosening. The tips of the pines were a shade brighter than last week. Something beneath the soil was stirring. I don't need anyone to believe me. She smiled faintly. I just need them to stop thinking kindness only belongs to humans. That night she wrote one more letter. She didn't seal it. Just folded it twice and tucked it beneath the braid. Then, in a voice not quite louder than breath, she spoke into the stillness. They weren't people, but they didn't leave me. And that was what mattered. Not their anatomy, not their mystery, but the fact that when she lay broken, they didn't turn away. They stayed. And that was the truest proof she had of their existence. Not science, but mercy. She closed her eyes and let the memory wash through her one more time. Not the fear, not the cold. The moment she realized she'd been lifted from the snow not to be studied or interrogated, but because something had seen her as worth saving. And in that moment, she remembered what it felt like to belong, even if only for a little while. Now she was leaving this behind, not as evidence, but as witness, a quiet testament, a whispered reminder that in the places we least expect it, someone may still choose to be kind, even if they don't look like us, even if they never speak, even if they vanish before we can say thank you, and maybe that's enough. So now, dear listener, whoever you are, wherever you're sitting, however you found this, let me ask you something. If something that wasn't human saved your life, would you tell the world, or would you protect them the way they protected you? Would you try to prove it? Or would you let the truth live quietly, like roots under the snow? Would you shout it, or would you whisper it, late at night, when the world is still and your voice is the only thing breathing? Tell me, what would you do? And more than that, where are you listening from, friend? What's your name? How far can a story like this travel, if you carry it with you? If you believe even a little, if you're still here, I want you to know, I see you. And I thank you for listening with your heart, not your eyes. If this story moved something in you, stay with us. Speak softly in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from, what name the world knows you by, and maybe who you were before this story found you. If you feel it deserves to be remembered, don't let it vanish. Like, share, subscribe. Not for numbers, but to build something quiet. A community of those who still believe that mercy matters, and that some things in this world, the best things, aren't here to be hunted. They're here to be honored, and maybe, if we're lucky, to be loved in return. Some stories aren't meant to be proven. They aren't trophies or headlines or answers we can frame and hang on a wall. They live quietly in the corners of memory, whispered between those who still believe there is more to this world than what can be measured or explained. Because sometimes the most important truths don't come wrapped in logic. They come wrapped in kindness, in silence, in the choice someone makes to stay beside you when they could have walked away. This was never a story about fear. It was never about spectacle or mystery for mystery's sake. It was about something far older than language, about the way compassion doesn't need a face like yours to be real, or a voice like yours to be heard. Sometimes the deepest kind of mercy comes from those we do not understand. And sometimes what saves us isn't science or faith or even luck. It's a decision, made in a moment when no one else was looking. That's what makes it sacred. The world is loud right now, fast, sharp, divided. But if you're still listening, if this story stirred something in you, even quietly, then maybe you felt it too. That pull, that ache, that strange and beautiful knowing that love, in its truest form, doesn't ask to be believed. It only asks to be remembered. We may never agree on what's out there in the woods, but we can agree on this. Kindness is never wasted. Presence matters. And sometimes the softest steps leave the deepest imprint. If you're still here, thank you. You made it to the end. Not just of a story, but of a feeling that wanted to be shared with someone like you. So, tell me, where are you listening from? What name do you go by, friend? And how far do you think a story like this can travel, if we carry it gently together? If this spoke to you, if it found a place in your heart, I invite you to leave a comment below. Let this be a place where belief isn't mocked, where memory is honored, where those who still feel things deeply can gather, even for just a moment. And if you haven't already, go ahead and like, subscribe, and follow this channel. Not for numbers, not for noise, but to help build a quiet community of those who understand that not everything needs proof. Some things just need to be held, from the still corners of the forest to the still corners of your heart. Thank you for being here. You're part of something now, and maybe, just maybe, that's what matters most.